think we are good to get started. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Calla Walsh. I'm a member of the CPUSA International Department, and I'm also the co-chair of the National Network on Cuba, and I will be your moderator tonight. We have a really wonderful lineup for our webinar, so I'm excited to introduce our speakers and then kick us off. True multilateralism begins with giving developing countries an equal seat at the table. Long gone are the days when a handful of powerful nations could bully and pressure the rest of the world. In this new multilateral world, all nations have the right to choose an independent development path. In this new multilateral world, mutually beneficial relations and win-win cooperation help to further the development of developing countries. This stands in stark contrast to the outdated mentalities of bloc confrontation, zero-sum thinking, and hegemonism. The People's Republic of China has furnished us with some great examples of the new global trend of multilateralism, including the Belt and Road Initiative and recently the Global Civilization Initiative. I'm pleased to moderate this event with distinguished comrades and activists from around the world. Tonight, we will hear from Alvaro Rodriguez, the International Secretary of the Communist Party USA, Shiyong Jie from the Party School of the Communist Party of China Central Committee, and Michaela Nando Erskog, a researcher with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the International Secretary of CPUSA, Alvaro Rodriguez.
Hello, everyone. As Calla mentioned, my name is Alvaro Rodriguez, and today is a discussion of China and its relationship to the developing countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. To start with, I'm going to share some slides with you that show the data. The global changes underway today are in Latin America and the Caribbean countries are they're undergoing some significant changes. These changes are very exciting, and I want to share this impact of these changes with you today. I want to start by addressing three main ideas. This includes the benefits of a new world without a hegemon. This is a world where all countries have an equal place at the decision table. Another idea is that friendship and cooperation yield a more peaceful and developed world. And thirdly and lastly, that countries can exercise their sovereignty only in a multilateral world. Now we will focus on one of the initiatives launched by China. One of the most important is China's Belt and Road Initiative. BRI is an acronym and abbreviation for China's land-based Silk Road, an economic belt, and 21st century maritime Silk Road connecting China to much of the world. This initiative took place in 2013 and later relabeled Green BRI for its focus in sustainable development and environmental protection. The Belt and Road Initiative already includes about 147 countries, of which 20 are in Latin America and the Caribbean. The BRI countries already represent 40% of the world's production and over 60% of the world's population. Other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have formally asked to join the Belt and Road Initiative countries. Here we see a map with a view of countries that have already joined the Belt and Road Initiative. The map shows when the countries joined. You can also see the upward trend in the growth of BRI since 2017. China has become the largest trading partner in Latin America with over 448 billion US dollars, or approximately 3 trillion yuan in trade as of 2021. Trade volume is still growing in the region. This slide covers some of the top China partners in Latin America and the Caribbean. This includes Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. Socialist solidarity between Cuba and the People's Republic of China is making a huge contribution to overcome the economic impact of the inhumane and unilateral 60-year US-imposed embargo against Cuba. This has created a tremendous amount of pain in a developing country such as Cuba. China is not only helping with mutually beneficial trade, but also making significant needed investments in Latin America and the Caribbean. The Biden administration vows to help protect Latin American countries and Caribbean countries from external coercion, including from the People's Republic of China. No such protection is needed nor desired. The United States offers Latin America and the Caribbean countries financing through the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and similar institutions. As we know, these global lending institutions are headquartered in Washington, D.C. and have a predatory relationship with developing countries. China's infrastructure investment helped Latin America and the Caribbean countries become more independent, sovereign, and more developed. Some examples of the coercion used against Latin American countries trying to increase commercial relations with China include, these are some examples from Mexico. Mexico canceled a contract with China for a high-speed rail under pressure from the U.S. This happened during Mexico's Peña Nieto administration in 2014. More recently, Henry Cuellar, a U.S. member of Congress from Texas, warned Mexico not to allow tech companies from China to invest in Mexico. The U.S. State Department has denounced China's Huawei technology enterprise since 2012. The U.S. asked Mexico to sell them Mexico's interoceanic corridor project in order to keep China firms out. This huge project is similar in scope to the Panama Canal. Huawei already has invested in one of 10 industrial parks in this project. Mexico stated that all countries are invited to invest in the project, but it will remain a Mexican project. Other Latin American countries and Caribbean countries have also been bullied for trying to improve economic relations with China. This is a map that shows the very large and significant project in Mexico, which will provide a transoceanic corridor through the Isthmus of Mexico. This isthmus area, the distance from the Pacific to the Gulf is only less than 300 kilometers. Large ships will unload from Asia and other countries on the Pacific side of this area. Products will be assembled in Mexico's 10 new industrial parks and then reloaded on the Gulf of Mexico port for shipping to the east coast of the U.S. or other countries. This large project will help development in southern Mexico, which is one of the poorest regions of the country. And also this country also installs more rails in southern Mexico, as can be seen in the map. So this is a very important development project for Mexico. China relates to other countries in a different way. While China is a large investor in Latin America and the Caribbean, it does not establish military bases. China helped Latin America and the Caribbean countries with millions of vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic. China also sent other life-saving medical supplies. This region also received vaccines from Russia and Cuba. China exercises caution while engaging with Latin America and Caribbean countries to avoid confrontation with the U.S. hegemonic ambitions. China does not engage in neoliberal policies and relates to countries with different ideologies with a win-win approach. This is very important. The expansion of BRIC countries has also had an enormous positive influence on all developing countries. An already announced change includes an alternative currency. This change, plus that of other associated countries, will undermine the petrodollar as the reserve currency of the world. And this is a huge change for the world. Here we have a photo of the presidents of the original BRICS countries. Lula is now the president of Brazil. So countries represented in the photo from left to right include Brazil, India, China, Russia, and South Africa. Two of these countries, China and Brazil, just announced that they will conduct trade in China's currency, the yuan. This year, trade between Brazil and China will exceed 1 trillion yuan. The BRIC countries are growing and looking at establishing their own currency. The BRIC countries already exceed the production of the G7 countries. This is a significant achievement. They also have a new development bank that competes with the IMF and the World Bank. The next meeting of the BRICS countries is this summer. 5 new members are expected to join, including Argentina and Mexico from Latin America. These 2 countries plus Brazil are the largest economies of Latin America. The bottom line is that positive changes in the air for developing countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. These countries will finally be able to be free, sovereign, and improving the lives of their working people. Thank you for your attention, and back to you, Cal.
Thank you so much, Alvaro, for that wonderful presentation. Now I am honored to introduce Shiyong Jie from the Party School of the CPC Central Committee. She's an associate professor, deputy director of the Department of Global Governance and International Organization, a member of the Institute for International Strategic Studies, and the Party School of the CPC Central Committee. She got her PhD in International Relations from Peking University in 2013, and her current research focuses on global governance, international institutions, and international political economy.
It is my great honor to be here and give you some points about China's contribution to the international community. And my colleagues call me to introduce something China with the developing countries, but I change a little bit. I want to show you some important concept and the logic of philosophy of China's relations with other countries. Maybe this could help you to understand China's policy in the future. And it is, I just found your presentation actually gave me a lot of examples for me to introduce China's story in the future. And I think that's really helpful. To me, I want to show you first that China's view of global governance, or how to share with others in the international forum. And we start the key principles are extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits, which means all parties here, no matter you are a developed country or developing countries, we should have your tone when we discuss some important issues here. And then everyone here should do something for the contribution. And at last, everyone can share from the outcome. So we think that is different from the Western countries. And you can see the philosophy or Chinese traditions here. Chinese, the old saying is 己所不欲，勿施于人. That means one should not impose on others what he himself does not desire. And also, we have old saying that cut one's feet to fit their shoes. That is very stupid. And we can also see that President Xi Jinping always taught, I only know if the shoes fit when I wear them. That means China thought, if we like something, we will encourage others to benefit with them. But if we find something is not so good, we will not impose them to others. I think that logic is very simple. And you see, from the opening up policy since 1979, we always impose some concept from other countries, especially from the Western countries, on the development or other things. We learned a lot. But since the 40 years experience, we actually summarize something ourselves. And then when we find these lessons are important and very good, we now want to others can share and benefit with this experience. I think the high quality development is very important one. That means we should develop in different ways. That means innovation, coordination, sharing, green, and open are very important. When we do the economic development domestically, we follow these 5 important concepts. And we found it's really helped us, at least for the last 10 years. And then when we found it is so important, President Xi Jinping brings this concept to the international forum. I think the first time is the Hangzhou summit of the G20 summit. And then for that, we then summarize more. I think you are very familiar with China's path to modernization recently. But I think the most important concept here is that China does not want others to follow us to use Chinese way, but we want other different countries should find their way, their path to modernization. So when China successfully found our way, we hope different countries from Africa, from Latin American, from Asian, they could find their way. We know traditionally the modernization means Western style modernization, but recently we thought maybe different country can find their own shoes. So we can see here, in China's concept, the modernization should be a huge population. Everyone should benefit from it. And then it is common prosperity for all. And also, it is not just for material development, but also the culture as the ethical development is also very important. And then the harmony between humanity and nature is very important. Also, the peaceful development, we do not invade other countries for our development. We thought could happen when we cooperate and peacefully develop. So that is China's path for development. And also, recently, China proposed, especially President Xi Jinping proposed some very important initiative. So here we can see the first one is the Global Development Initiative. I think that is also another very important concept. That is how to develop. I just mentioned we do that domestically, then we summarize to the Global Development Initiative. That means development as a priority first. A second key point is a people-concerned approach. I think you guys know that a Chinese Communist Party always say the people is the most important thing. Every policy here should be people-centered. And we summarize here that people-centered approach is very important. And then benefit for all. I think that is also, we can see previously, and also innovation driven and harmony between the man and nature and the result-oriented actions. So President Xi Jinping gives this on the UN firstly. We can see a good example here about the development. I think the AIIB, that means Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Why we built this bank? And the first president of this bank, Jin Liqun, said, it is time for China to do something for other Asian countries. Because we know last 40 years, China benefit a lot from the multilateral financial institutions like ADB or World Bank and others. When we found that a lot of other Asian countries, they are urged for infrastructure development, but they lack of money. They cannot loan from other financial institutions. Then we decide to build this bank, and we can say it is very, very international. You can check its website, all in English, no Chinese characters. And the slogan here is AIIB to be lean, clean, and green. And we can see its program are all not only the traditional infrastructure, but also very modern and urgent infrastructure, like the economic resilience, like the financial, and like the ICT, I mean the 5G or other equipment and others. I think that is very good example here. And you know what? Who benefits the most from this bank? Actually, it's India. We know that India has a boundary problem with China, but still India benefits the most from this bank. And also there are other example here. For example, in Africa, we not only send experts to talk with the African bros, teach them how to farm and how to build, how to grow things, but also we help the young generation how to do the small business on internet and others. We can see here, Jack Ma give lessons to the African young people. And also we built railways. And when we built the railways, we also focus on the environment protection. We can see the railway is not just on the ground, but we built it on the high bridge, because that will not disturb the life of the wildlife. We can see a lot of animals here could still walk through under the bridge here. And also we can see we taught the young woman can be the real way drivers and help a lot of young people to find their jobs. I think these are very good examples here. And also, we also proposed other very important initiative, for example, on the security. Here we can see, when we talk about global security, we thought we should commit it to the version of common, comprehensive, cooperate, and sustainable security. And also, when we talked about the security, it should be respect the sovereignty and territory integrity of all countries. And we should commit it to abide all the proposed and principles of the UN Charter under the UN principle, and stay committed to taking the legitimate and security concerns to all countries. That means different countries, no matter it is big or it's strong or weak, we should respect their interests. And also the security issue should be peacefully resolved through the dialogue and consultation instead of the war or others. And last but not least, both the traditional and non-traditional domain should be attract our attentions. And the last, President Xi Jinping just proposed another very important concept, that is global civilization initiative. I think that is very important, because when we talk about a development, we will always lose something, that is civilization. When we talk about civilization right now, we always say about Western ones, but we know the developing countries held various and very good civilizations. So here we saw civilization is also a very important domain here. We thought respect for the diversity of civilization is very important. We advocate the common values of humanity and high value the inherence and innovation of civilization. And last but not least, joint contributing robust international people-to-people exchange and cooperation is very important. I think that is all I want to say. Time is up. Thank you. I want to hear more from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, I'm going to introduce Michaela Nando-Erskog, a researcher with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. She has an MA in history from the university currently known as Rhodes, and she is a graduate for the Unit for Humanities at the Rhodes University Fellowship Program. She works closely with educational programming in the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa, and in the last few years, she has been dedicated to work that builds the international networks of social movements, trade unions, and people's organizations on the African continent, with a particular focus on education and solidarity work. Without further ado, I'll hand it back over to Michaela.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the previous contributions. Particularly right now, I think it's really important that you are creating these platforms to have sober, rational, factual, data-driven, as well as theoretically nuanced conversations about China and its position in the world. Because I was watching CNN this morning, and when China's conducting, military air exercises over Taiwan, which is part of its, territory and part of its One China policy, the headline is China is gearing for war. China prepares for war, whilst just a week ago, I think it was, the US was doing military exercises in, I think it was in the Philippines, and is trying to expand their presence in the South China Sea. But that's considered to be a peace-building exercise, right? So I think it's really important that we are having these conversations and these discussions in this particular conjuncture. So my inputs are going to basically be looking at Africa, and my focus will be on the role that China's played in relation not only to development, but a certain type of development, which I'm appreciative of Xiangjie's highlighting of some of the conceptual basis of this different type of development, as well as what it has meant for the African sovereignty project. Because essentially, since the 1980s, with the rise of the neoliberal age and the different waves of structural adjustment, the African continent, the project that was initiated through national liberation was severely eroded. We were in this moment in the late 60s where we saw these possibilities, but as many of you know, many of our key leaders were assassinated, many economic policies that largely benefit the West and the former colonial powers were pushed and embedded. And Africa, for the last, I would say up until 2010 or so, has not been able to pursue an independent and sovereign development project because they only had one option, and that was to beg for scraps from the former colonizers. But something is changing right now. And I want to start with a small anecdote. Many of you might have seen in February that there was the Munich Security Conference was held. And at that conference, we had, representatives from different global South countries. One of them was the Namibian Prime Minister, Sarah Konkongelwa Amadila. And she was basically asked about her country's decision to abstain on the UN General Assembly's resolution to condemn Russia for the war in Ukraine. And she's a largely like a liberal economist, not a very, left-wing person, basically without flinching said, and I want to quote her, she said, "We are promoting a peaceful resolution of the conflict so that the entire world and all the resources of the world can be focused on improving the conditions of the people of the world instead of being spent on acquiring weapons, killing people, and actually generating hostilities." And she talked about how all this money that's going to arms could be better utilized to promote development, not only in Ukraine, but in Africa and Asia and in Europe itself, where people are experiencing increasing hardships. And this kind of sentiment has also been echoed with different African leaders, such as, I think it was in September last year, President Macky Sall, who was then the chair of the African Union and the president of Senegal. He basically spoke out at the UN General Assembly saying that, I'll quote him again, that Africa has suffered enough of the burden of history. It does not want to be the breeding ground for a new Cold War, but rather a pole of stability and opportunity to all its partners. And I highlight these two that seem a little bit unrelated maybe to China, but have a deep significance that comes largely as a result from the opportunities that China-Africa relationships have been able to establish. Since the 2000 making of the China-Africa Forum or Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC, we've seen the increasing relationship between China and Africa, whether it's trade, whether it's politics, whether it's cultural, whether it's the fact that I think now China has the biggest amount of African students. I think it's 60,000 or so a year, which is second to France, which we know France is because they colonized, a solid part of the African continent, and therefore the language dependency has kept people going there. But since in the last two decades or so, the continued engagement with China has actually allowed for Africans to, for the first time, have an option. We no longer have to, basically, to put it harshly, but we don't have to go and like beg for crumbs at the seat of the IMF, of the World Bank, of the different Paris Club, the London Club. And I think that this has created an opening that in the immediate might not feel as significant, but in the long term has the potential to build a different and new international order where I think, Carla, you had said, where we can be having an equal seat at the table. And for a long time, Africa has not had that. But I just want to, before I go into some of the significance of that, maybe just a few highlights of the China-Africa relations in the last couple of decades, which, just for those who don't know, since the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the Third World has consistently not only been a source of inspiration and solidarity for China, who, when they emerged out of the anti-Japanese aggression war, were the 11th poorest country. I think the 10 before them, most of them were African countries. And in the space of 70 plus years, has basically become, one of the most important social and economic experiments in recent history. 800,000 people were lifted out of poverty. We've seen them rise to, in PPP terms, PPP GDP, be the leading economy, essentially. And so for us on the African continent, who continue, many of those countries who were listed as the poorest in the world in 1949, still are the poorest or amongst the poorest in the world. And so for us on the continent, it's extremely important to understand how has China been able to build this process, this socialist construction, with all its shifts and changes. As Xiongje was saying, we don't necessarily want to replicate it, but we want to understand what kind of methods of analysis, what kind of processes of building people's power can enable such a significant jump in the space of such a short amount of time. But jumping back to the relationship between the African continent and China. Now, I think it was in 2000, our bilateral trade was around 10 billion, and it has significantly grown. In 2021, it was 254 billion, becoming the largest bilateral partner in the world, far surpassing the US. But we've also seen that China's shown material commitments to various improvements that have shifted also the infrastructural landscape, the economic landscape, the political possibilities to a large extent through different projects of funding infrastructure, of technological exchange, not only of their own advances in quantum computing and robotics and telecommunications, that will be something that the African continental free trade area will be looking towards and hoping to get technological transfers around it. But China is also invested in key infrastructure projects like Xiongje mentioned one of the railway lines, the Nairobi one, but we've also seen rail projects in Sudan and Senegal, in Mali and Guinea. We've seen massive hydroelectric and hydropower projects in Nigeria and in Ghana. We've seen huge telecommunication investments in Ethiopia. Ethiopia has completely, changed in the last 10 years due to these investments, as well as in Ghana, Kenya. And, in 2020 December, we saw there was the breaking ground on the new construction of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Addis Ababa. So there's significant things happening. But let's go to, for example, the question of aid. And I think this is important what Xiongje was mentioning about how we conceive of this differently, is that Chinese aid, unlike the IMF aid or Western commercial investments, does not come with, the vice of, for example, debilitating conditionalities. IMF says we will only give you, which Ghana recently signed a deal in December for 3 billion over the next 3 years. But of course, it comes with not so cryptic conditions that they're going to have to basically enact a new austerity wave where they'll be divesting from a lot of public services, public infrastructural projects will be pulled back on, and essentially they're going to have to do a lot of, austerity measures basically in order to be allowed to spend this money. So again, it doesn't go into the right projects that would actually benefit the people. But also, there's been a ton of evidence that there are more favorable terms when it comes to agreements signed by China. And some of this also comes from China's theory of patient capital, which until now has been adopted within the boundaries of China, but as slowly through the Chinese state banks emerged as a major investor outside its territory. So China is now the second largest investing country in the world, with the China Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank being the major investors. And this concept of this patient capital is that the state agencies provide more long-term investments and are not looking for a short repayment schedule. And they also fully understand that these loans are given to, release infrastructural bottlenecks and to therefore support social development. So borrower countries are given more flexibility. And we've seen especially across the course of the pandemic, how there's been loan forgiveness, there's been restructuring, there's been creating moratoriums on repayments or extensions of those payments. And we have not seen that same kind of leeway coming from the major bondholders, wealthy bondholders based in the West world. And I mean, some of you might have seen Kamala Harris was visiting Ghana recently, and their solution to the debt crisis that Ghana is facing is that they want to deploy a technical assistant from the US Treasury Department. So they're going to send somebody who's going to sit with the finance minister, and supposedly that's their big grand idea when when Ghana is basically, I think they pay their GDP, their debt to GDP ratio is over 100%, right? So they're in a very critical situation. And rather than assisting to pressure wealthy bondholders in Europe and the US, Kamala Harris and the US government believe that having a technical assistant will somehow change a more structural issue. So they're putting a lot of, dressing over what is a much deeper issue that requires a lot more radical approaches if we're really going to assist Africa. So this is all to say that for many, and I'm quoting one of the former Senegalese presidents, Wade, China's approach to our needs is simply better adapted than the slow and sometimes patronizing post-colonial approach of European investors, donor agencies, and non-governmental organizations. But then coming to this moment right now, what I want to highlight on maybe the last few minutes of my area is, and I'm welcome to maybe in the Q&A talk about, for example, when it comes to debt, Western media has largely exaggerated the proportion of China-held debt. I mean, there was a study last year that came out from a collaboration between Cambridge and another university, which found that China holds maybe 18% of external public debt, whilst largely Western bondholders hold, I think it's like a third, let me just double check my notes, a third come from International Financial Institute, a third come from Eurobonds. So the majority, again, is held in the historically or the inheritors of the kind of colonial relationships in the past. So I'm also glad to talk about the debt trap narrative because it's completely bogus and it's clearly part of the US's broader strategy to undermine China's relationships. But for the last bit, I did want to talk a little bit about this year is the anniversary of the African Union's 60 years since it was founded, previously known as the Organization for African Unity. And in this kind of inaugural moment, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the leader of Ghana at the time, basically warned leaders that in order to achieve economic integration and stability, the organization would have to be an explicitly political one, motivated by a clear and consistent anti-imperialist position. And to quote him, he said, "African unity is above all a political kingdom, which can only be gained by political means. The social and economic development of Africa will come only when the political kingdom, not the other way around." Well, when within the political kingdom, not the other way around. And unfortunately, in the last 3 decades of the last 2 decades of the 20th century, we saw a kind of undermining of the political project that would need to be inaugurated if we wanted to have the kind of social and economic development that would actually advance the needs of the people. His vision right now is completely hollowed out. But in this moment that we've seen kind of the refusal of African leaders to toe the line in the new Cold War, we are having a reconfiguration of international relationships that could open up the possibilities. Part of the few considerations that I think we have to make, though, however, is I don't think it will take the form that we might have considered it would maybe 20 or 10 years ago, because, for example, we at Tricontinental have had an ongoing discussion about the concept of multipolarity. And one of the discussions is multipolarity in the traditional sense might not necessarily be the type of international layout that we would like. Perhaps we need to think about how do we build regionalism and make regionally strong projects. As Alvaro mentioned with the BRICS, there's a new potential now with Lula in power and the relationships between China and the rest of those BRICS countries for us to bring regional projects that create almost bulwarks against imperialism and not necessarily having multipolar of everyone is as equal, but I think it should be more in the Marxist sense of each according to their ability and each according to their needs, which is a conception of equality that liberals don't often understand. And so how the regionalist projects, whether it's the kind of currency, you saw, what's his name, Senator Marco Rubio was freaking out that he said in a few years' time, our sanctions won't even matter because all the global South countries will be trading in their own currencies. And he was freaking out whilst we were all like, this is one of the possible ways we can fight back against the US dollar hegemony. The other aspect is I think we're entering, especially with China, Africa, into a phase of from quantity to quality. And this is a serious challenge for all of us, is by 2015, financial investments basically peaked, and they've been getting lower in terms of, like, if you look at foreign direct investment coming from China. But I think it's because we're entering a phase where we want to have more qualitative interventions, qualitative projects that aren't necessarily about the bulk. We, of course, have an infrastructure deficit on the African continent. We are about we need 100 billion per year if we want to meet our infrastructural needs, which is still a concern. But there is a feeling and a sensibility that we need to move to more qualitative relationships that are based on deepening our understandings of not only we know what our needs are, but what our shared vision is for the future. And Xiongjie mentioned some of the names, but at Tricontinental, we've been trying to deepen projects like that, such as our studies on China's socialist construction, such as we just launched this collaboration, Wenhua Zhongheng, which is a English translation of a Chinese journal. I think it's known as the Beijing Review, but we have it on our website if you want to check it out. But we will now do a quarterly launch in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, because we would like to have some of the intellectual and political debates that are happening in China that haven't been always so accessible because they're highly theoretical. But we want to be able to have those discussions and expose the global south to the different ideas. For example, one of the editor of the journal, Yang Ping, he has a section on the Ukraine crisis and the building of a new international system. And one of the criticisms he has, or proposals he has for China, is that, for example, when we look at the BRI, it's been largely driven by a commercial interest. And he said, he's saying we, China, we need to find mechanisms of having more politically strategic interventions. So we move away from this kind of bigger quantitative model to a qualitative. What are the strategic countries and projects that need to happen for a certain type of political outcome that would benefit the continent more strongly in the future? So right now, two things I'll say before I end, I think I'm still within my time, is one is we are needing to make greater efforts, particularly in the African continent, to better understand not only what China's intellectual traditions are all about, because they don't center Western models of development. They have a totally different civilizational conception of society. I mean, I was introduced to this concept of tianxia, which is under the heavens, and it's an old historical process, but has a very interesting modernity to it, where it's the conception of, Xiongjie mentioned parts of it, and you are better to explain it if you want to later, but this conception of human communities, not only in harmony with nature, but in harmony with one another, and based on a mutual beneficial model of exchange. And for me, that resonates in many ways, because in Africa, we call it Ubuntu, this idea that you are a person based on your relationality to other people, and our sustainability as a community depends on understanding that relationality. So right now, I think we need to deepen how we understand our different ideas and intellectual traditions in order to make stronger policy and political interventions. But I will add that as a communist who, on the African continent, we don't have any communist governments that exist. We also have this kind of double mentality or double speak and double move we often have to do, where on the one hand, we have to applaud the fact that South Africa has played an important role in building this kind of non-alignment or reinvigorating this non-alignment, and it plays an important role in BRICS, and that they should always take an anti-imperialist stance. But we also have to work with our movements who are largely highly exploited and repressed by our own governments. So we have the task of building our internal projects that might better meet the needs of our people, but simultaneously, much as Mao had to align with the KMT against the anti-Japanese aggression, or the Japanese aggression war, the way Lenin had to call for European countries not to enter into the world war, we also have this issue of we have to figure out and show our own people who is the true enemy at the structural level. What is the principal contradiction that we have to deal with, whilst still building our internal processes that manage to meet people's needs and manage to advance the working class agenda within our countries.
Thank you so much for those three amazing presentations. We're going to jump into our Q&A now. So just as a reminder, you can ask questions in the chat. I'm going to direct some of these questions to everyone and some of them pointed at individuals. So let's start with a general question. Can our panelists give some examples of green development and ecological cooperation between China and other countries? How has China contributed to the international struggle against climate change? So anyone's welcome to jump in and respond to this.
I would like to give one example. Take the case of Cuba after the COVID-19 pandemic. Most countries came out of the pandemic certainly weakened, and because of the shutdown of a lot of industry. And and Cuba came out of it worse because the price of oil went up and food prices also went up because of problems with supply chain, and also because of the U.S. economic sanctions on the Russian Federation. And that created also some food interruptions and caused food prices to go up. And one of the biggest problems that Cuba has is that it has very little fuel to run its industry. So what has happened there is that they're building solar plants in Cuba, and the Chinese government has gave them a lot of free solar panels to build the solar plants. So here is a green renewable project that fit the needs of the Cuban people. And so China, that was a very beneficial relationship provided by China to Cuba. So that would be just one example, and there's many others, I'm sure.
I think in the last 3 or 4 years, the main way has been through all renewable sources of energy, where China has pledged to reduce their, and has been reducing their coal production in Africa. And so it, like, for example, in the Central African Republic, a huge Chinese funded solar power station has been under construction. I think it was completed, but it began construction in 2021. So I think nearly more than a third of existing energy projects are solar, and then I can't remember the other elements, but that's one of the areas. The other problem, though, is we have an issue of China has made many pledges, even in November of 2021 at the Dakar meeting of the Forum on China-Africa cooperation, particularly around like flood preparedness, because we've seen the East African coast severely affected by, various cyclones and hurricanes, etc. But we have the issue of our African governments don't want to prioritize that. So it's like China can only give so much, but what are we bringing to the table? And I was actually at that meeting doing some coverage, and I have to say that what was quite disappointing is it felt like we're being given this opportunity, but African leaders are, one, not bringing anything to offer, as if Africa doesn't have rich historical traditions of indigenous environmental protections, and as well as our conceptions of how we should interact with nature. But two, we also need to, there's not a unity within the African Union on what we need to prioritize and what kind of collective bargaining we should do in a way that strategically reinforces some of these regionalist conceptions of development that might, kind of affect a group of countries that can then bolster their relationship.
Okay, I also want to share with you about something. Firstly, that is a domestic example. You see, in China, the local government officials will call to the account if they have the problem of the development, if they have the polluted things happen. And it is very strict in domestic domain right now. So we always say the green hills, green mountains are very, very important fortune to China. And just as I mentioned just now, I think this concept is so important. We always raise this set to the green development to the international forum. You can see a lot of people criticize China's BII because of the environment things. But in fact, we will check our local government or other media are always strict with China, a Chinese program, especially the environment protection things. But right now, China's government and China's factory, we focus a lot more on this green development. And also, you know, China is biggest manufacturer of the soda infrastructure and also the electronic cars, electronic batteries. So we hope that other countries, especially the developing countries, when they are doing the process of modernization, they can benefit from that of China's lessons, because we have already experienced polluted, then we have to deal with it, and then we will pursue a green development path. But we hope other countries do not follow our pattern and go to the green development strictly, do not share with the polluted way. So I think that's a point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I've seen many of those solar panels at use in Cuba, so it certainly is helping alleviate the fuel shortage crisis there and to promote green development. I want to ask another question we got. Can Xiongji or Alvaro Rodriguez talk about relationships between communist parties of different countries? This is a great question.
Yeah, I guess as the International Secretary of the Communist Party USA, I would like to say something about that. Karl Marx says that workers of the world unite because capitalism is a global system. Then workers have to also be united in solidarity. You know, the communist and workers' parties have to be united in the struggle to overcome the current stage of capitalism, which is imperialism. And so we have to work together and cooperate in a fraternal way to make changes in the world. So I think that's something we have to engage in. Internationalism and anti-imperialism go together. As long as we have injustice in the world, you know, peace is not as probable, because peace is the product of justice, and it is our task as communists to struggle for justice in the world, to end exploitation, and to pool our resources together on things that are of common interest among the communist and workers' parties of the world.
I think that is a very important part of the communication with other communist party in the world. And you see, as the teacher of the Communist Party here, for example, we trained some or gave some kind of training program to some countries like Vietnam or Laos, if they need some kind of training, for example, on the party building or the development, economic development, and other kind of how to improve the ability of the government and other things. If they need and they wish, they can give this kind of requirement, and we will do this certain kind of training things. And also we have certain kind of forum, high-level forum with other communist parties around the world, and share with them a lot of the current important issues. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much. Next, I'm going to point a question to Michaela. Could you expound upon the Chinese debt trap myth and explain that to our listeners?
So I think this was around about the time that was in the mid-Trump administration, around 2019 or so, where we got increasingly a lot of news, especially from American media outlets, talking about the Chinese debt trap. And basically the idea that China lures in low-income countries, particularly in Africa, into unfair predatory loans that they basically think that they won't be able to pay back, as well as sometimes they'll be circulating these stories that China was going to seize Entebbe Airport, which is the main airport, international airport in Uganda. But on kind of closer examination, a lot of those actual stories, like the seizing of the Entebbe Airport, was factually incorrect. Ironically, that story was circulating just a month before the Forum on China-Africa met in November 2021, which I don't think is coincidental. I think it was trying to, create a certain type of perception. But one is that that's not the case. The issue with the Entebbe Airport is that the people who'd brokered the deal had taken for granted the certain clauses that they could have in Uganda basically made stronger restrictions or stronger demands in order to secure certain interests, which I think China would have gone along with, but they just hadn't really conceived of what the project would look like and the different working relationships. So there are constraints and limitations, but we live in a world not of our making, and we find ourselves in a capitalist world where there are certain things we need to do, and there's certain economic relationships that already exist, but we're trying to advance with the best we possibly can. But with the debt trap narrative, I think it's kind of ironic because the real debt trap comes from the 1970s, 1980s, from the IMF structural adjustment programs, because it essentially gave clear conditionalities that you need to liberalize your economies, you need to privatize your common resources, you need to lower spending on social services, you need to prioritize infrastructure that basically only serves capital and those investors. I mean, Walter Rodney wrote about this in, the underdevelopment of, or how Europe underdeveloped Africa, where he talks about, and there's a South African politician, sorry to pedal back, there's a South African politician a few years ago, a conservative, who said, no, we need to be grateful about the fact that colonialism brought us trains. But what she doesn't understand is that those trains don't serve the people's needs. Those are trains that are used to take the resources, and as Walter Rodney said, and leave holes in the ground where, the raw materials once sat. But it's none of the infrastructure, colonial infrastructure, served the people. It's either served a minority of the colonial elites, the settler colonizers, or it served to ensure more efficiency in terms of exploitation of raw materials, of agricultural materials, but it was never geared towards the people. And which is why, and people have criticized this mythologizing of the Tanzania-Zambia Freedom Railway that was built and funded by Chinese workers, at least 50,000 Chinese workers between 1968 and 75 worked on creating a railway line between Zambia and Tanzania, because they were trying to ensure that Zambia and Tanzania could be independent of the Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe at the time, but the Rhodesian railway lines to go to the sea. So this was not only an economic thing of helping them trade better, but it was also a political intervention because they wanted the people of those countries to benefit. So A is that the real debt trap comes from historically the IMF, and we actually just released, I'm going to put a link in the group, we just released a study called Life or Debt, the stranglehold of neo-colonial financial institutions. And we have done work with they're called CAPE, the Collective of African Political Economists, who have made certain proposals on what could shift and address the debt crisis without relying on having to go to the West to address those things. So I'm going to share a link there. But I know I'm talking about several different things. It's because it's always such a complicated issue, but just to know that China holds a much smaller amount of debt than any of the Western bondholders. Those loans have much smaller and fewer smaller interest rates, lower interest rates. They don't come with conditionalities about how you need to, change your economic system. And they tend to be long-term, as I mentioned, this patient capital, where often you get to restructure, you get to change it, because China's thinking about this in the long term. You can't develop as a country if you don't have proper trains, proper roads, proper electrical systems, proper schooling infrastructure, etc. So it's showing material benefits that we don't see when it comes to loans from the IMF, because most of the time, as we're going to see in the case of Ghana, when we get a new loan or a restructuring, it's just so we can better service our existing loans. And so now we're also going to see, when it comes to the common framework that China sits in, which is basically how we're going to deal with the debt crisis at the UN level, it's going to be interesting to see what role China plays in terms of pushing and pressuring bondholders to basically cut these, essentially, what's the word? Not erroneous, but there's a word for basically a debt that is historical, that actually is being an affront to the people because the country's not able to pay, and they are spending more money on servicing debts rather than servicing people's interests. So I will be interested to see the role that China can play in that, and how our countries can also build this united front against debt that Thomas Sankara was talking about in the 1970s.
Thank you so much for really thoroughly demystifying the debt trap myth. And speaking of a united front, we got a question that says, how do we use the broad united front against the extreme right, as outlined in our CPUSA party program, to promote internationalism? Oliver, I think that'd be a great question for you to answer if you're willing.
The answer is certainly much more complex than the question. And the only thing that we have as an advantage is we have the working classes, the majority of the population. So unity is extremely important in this case. So we have to raise class and socialist consciousness in the working class, and that requires mass work and building a united front against a common enemy. In the case of the extreme right, it's jingoism, militarism, fascism. So we have to unite in the struggle for reforms in opposition. For instance, in the United States, one of the biggest issues right now is reproductive rights. Those are under attack. And even a judge has put in an order just recently, pretty much outlawing the use of an abortion medication. And so this is becoming a big issue, infringing on reproductive rights for women. And so you have to unite with people where they're at and what they're willing to struggle for, and form a united front. If on that particular issue, you may have to unite with people that you don't agree on other issues on, but you have to form a united, a popular front to fight effectively for that issue. So the lesson for the communists in their individual countries, where Micaela was talking about how we have to do that work, is that we have to organize, and we have to mobilize and energize people, raise their consciousness, and engage in mass work, because revolution is not going to come about until we have a higher level of consciousness in our country. And so we have to be able to do all of that.
Our next question for everyone is, what lessons can other countries, including the US, draw from China's successful experience with poverty alleviation?
I can give a small one, which one of the sources I put in there is we have a small study that we did in collaboration with some researchers here, looking particularly at the poverty alleviation project. But I think one of the major things, I'm currently in China now, one of the major things I've noticed or have been trying to grapple with and understand is the massive amount of not voluntarism in the sense we know it in the West, but how they're able to mobilize their people on such a large scale. We saw this with the pandemic of just organizing millions of people to do one task or to gear themselves around one task. And, you know, we call that human resources in the rest of the world, but the level of organization logistically, but also politically, for people to understand the importance of a certain project or process, I think is something that we totally underestimate and totally don't have a grasp over. Xiongjian mentioned this clear lakes, beautiful mountains. I'm not sure the exact wording. I was in Dali in Yunnan province, where there's this lake called Erhai Lake that over the last 2 decades, it was heavily polluted in the 90s. And in the last 2 decades, there's been this process of environmental restoration. But the amount of logistical collaboration they had to work with, there were farmers who were, their pigs' waste was polluting the river. There was people who are slightly richer who were living on the lake shore, who had to be removed. They had to completely rebuild it. They had to completely reorganize the area. They had to get a lot of basically human capacity, as well as, of course, resources in order to shift this. But now the water there is drinkable, and they've basically been able to recover what was largely I think it's called a level 5 level of pollution, where it could make you sick if you're drinking it in high doses. But the scale is, I just think, something we have no concept of. You know, you go to the train station, everyone is getting on that high-speed train on time, but it's a 16 cart train with over 1,000 people in one train. So the level of organization, and I say organization, is something that I think we need to work stronger on in our different regions, because I can't speak for your party, but for ours in the Global South is we have this dual task of not only organizing on a practical level, but then also educating people simultaneously on why this is important. And I mean, there are, 90 million members of the Communist Party of China, over 90 million. And there's general social consensus that, I think the surveys last year, 90% of society think that the Communist Party is doing well. We just can't even fathom that level of organization. And that's why I think it's so important to understand some of these more microscopic processes, but we just need to organize better. That's all I can say. We need to be more disciplined. We need to be looking at the details, because only a high level of organization can allow you to operate efficiently and effectively in the current conditions we have.
Okay, I also want to share with you about some lessons China, how to deal with the poverty of alleviation. I think China takes this very seriously, and we treat it not only for the poverty, the local government, but also the central government. You see, all the officials in the government, I mean, not only in the local ones, but also in the top in Beijing, the officials, they should do something to help the local, maybe farmers or others, do something. For example, the central government will send some expert to the local government and help them to deal with the poverty alleviation or other things. For example, I was in Fujian province from 2020 to 2021, and to the local government, and stay with them, and not only help them, but also learning how to push the poverty alleviation. So when we talk about this, not only the government, but also the state-owned the enterprises and other things, they will do their job as the social responsibilities. They should do something, and they will maybe build a kind of partnership with the certain poverty county or factory, and with them and give them certain what they could do, maybe money, maybe technology, maybe other kind of help to help the local government and local, like the farmers and the peasant and other peoples, to help them. I think that is a huge program. And everyone, when we talk about it, not only the President Xi Jinping talk about the poverty things, but the local officials and everyone should do something for them. I think that's what I want to say.
Thank you so much. We have so much to learn from China. Our next question, sorry to throw another question right at you, Xiangjie, but a comrade in Brazil asked for examples of international cooperation between China and Brazil. Like Alvaro mentioned, Brazil is one of the most important members of BRICS. It's one of the largest economies in the Americas.
I think Brazil and China just make a very important deal, and we not only the merchant deal, but also we said maybe we could deal with Asia not only in US dollar, but also in our own current. I think that is very important improvement now, because just as other counterparts just say that the dollar hegemony is so important right now, but as the most important, China and Brazil has already made the deal that China could and Brazil could trade in our own currency, and I think that is typical kind of communication. And also, I think more and more Chinese students and Chinese businessmen look forward to have more opportunity, not only the business one, but also the study and other the tourist. What we want to know more about Brazil and learn more about Brazil. I think we will share a much good future in the in not long time. Yes, that's what I want to say.
Thank you. Yeah, and of course, President Lula is visiting China right now on a very important visit. Our next question is from a CPUSA member in the Virginia district, and they asked, what can we do in the CPUSA to help promote global multilateralism and shared human values internationally against currently existing hegemony?
There is a lot that can be done by some Marxist-Leninists in Virginia. Certainly join our party. We welcome comrades. We welcome people that agree with our party program, and we encourage them to join us. We also encourage them to join our international department. That is our principal aim, is international solidarity, internationalism, anti-imperialism. And you can find out more about the international department through the redworldreview.org. And where you can apply to become active. We're doing a lot of things. We're working right now very heavily on the second international conference on internationalism and stopping Cold War 2.0, anti-imperialism. That is something we're working on right now, and we have formed work groups, and we're encouraging people to sign up for this. If you have some skills in graphics, in technology and video making and so forth, we really need your help. And if you have writing skills, we need your help. And we encourage you to go through redworldreview.org /international conference, and you can sign up, volunteer for work, and we want to put you to work immediately. There's a lot of work to be done. We're having a peace conference in the fall of this year, and our objective is how to strengthen the existing peace movement in this country, so that we can struggle for peace and against the warmongering that's going on. So that will be another great opportunity to get involved, and that has been sponsored by the Peace and Solidarity Commission of the CPUSA, and you can find out more about it at cpusa.org. So I encourage you to go into that website and find out more how you can get how to join the party, how to get engaged in mass actions, and so forth.
Great. Thank you so much, Alvaro. I think we are going to wrap up here. Thank you to our panelists for such a productive webinar, for joining us across oceans, across different time zones. We really, really appreciate your time and your important insights as we are moving towards building a multipolar world. So to our audience, please stay on the lookout for more international webinars. And like Alvaro said, don't forget to reserve your spot at the CPUSA's upcoming international conference at redworldreview.org. All those links are in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it.